Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks, starting to put the pieces in place to start making some transfer portal additions over the next couple of days and weeks. And it's been a slow start for South Carolina in the spring transfer portal window. The portal has been open for about a week. It's been very quiet on the South Carolina front. I don't think to a lot of South Carolina fans that's all that much of a surprise, especially if you follow this program pretty dang closely. We saw the exact same thing play out in the winter portal window as well. When you are South Carolina and you have the young nucleus of talent that South Carolina does, you're much more focused on retaining your roster and making sure these guys are going to be on your team in 2025 than going out and getting new pieces and new players. That's a massive storyline in this landscape of college football. I think for us college football fans, we get really infatuated with the new toys and the new shiny objects that are in the transfer portal and kind of forget that, hey, you got a lot of good players on your roster that you want to make sure you're keeping on your roster. Go back to the winter portal window. That winter portal window opened up on December 5th. South Carolina did not make their first transfer portal addition until December 18th, nearly 2 weeks after the transfer portal window officially opened. Why was that the case? They were much more focused on, hey, making sure Dylan Stewart's back for another year and Lenore Sellers and Tree Babalade. They took care of their pieces inside their program before they went out and started making transfer portal additions. It's the most important thing you can do as a program. You go look at the Georgia teams in 2021 and 2022. You go look at the Michigan team in 2023. Heck, even look at the Ohio State team in 2024. And I know they made some big time portal additions, Caleb Downs and Will Howard, Quinshawn Judkins. But, you make no mistake about it. The real reason that Ohio State won a national championship in 2024 is because they had guys like Jack Sawyer and JTT going into year 4, year 5 within that program. The teams that compete at the highest level of the sport, they will go out and make transfer portal additions when necessary, but the large focus for those teams are making sure they keep guys within the program. That's clearly something that South Carolina is very, very focused on doing, and I could not agree more with that process. Now, the second thing is let the market play out. I mean, you could go out and make some additions early on in the spring transfer portal window. I'll say this, with the last 24 hours, we've seen some very intriguing names enter their name into the portal. You kind of want to see what your options are before you start pulling the trigger and bringing guys into your program. I think South Carolina is doing that as well. So the combination of, hey, let's make sure everybody's happy on our roster first. Let's make sure that we have all the information we need in terms of who's going to be in the portal. Then we'll start going out and making some moves. And I think South Carolina, kind of like they did in the winter, kind of transitioning towards, all right, we got the guys within our roster taken care of. We have a better feel of who's going to be available in the portal. Let's go out and start making some moves and lining up some visits. Now, I want to start with some names that South Carolina's kicking the tires on early. I want to talk about some names that I think would be good additions for South Carolina as well. Before we get into it, as always, to the South Carolina fans, just want to start with a thank you. It's no secret that the boys, I really do have I have a blast talking this program, going back to the 2024 season, going back to the winter portal window. The amount of support the South Carolina fans have shown the boys during the offseason months has been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And more importantly, the South Carolina fans, especially if you're checking out this episode, I know dang well that y'all are probably pretty dialed in terms of what names are in the portal and what names you'd like to see South Carolina go out and get. Y'all let it fly in the comment section. We'll chop it up down there. Without further ado, let's start with Troy Pikes. Been in contact with South Carolina. South Carolina, I believe, is working on setting up a visit. This kid's really fascinating, and this is a kid that is wanted by a lot of heavy hitters. He took a visit to Georgia. He's taken a visit to Ohio State. South Carolina is going to try to get him on campus. The thing I love most about Troy Pikes is that, one, he is certainly going to come in and play a role for South Carolina in 2025. Whether he starts or whether he's a depth piece, I don't think that matters because we just need more bodies in the middle of that defensive line. The thing I love most about him is he's only going to be a redshirt sophomore in 2025. He's still getting better as a football player, especially with those extra COVID years. I feel like there's been so many names in the portal that are fifth, sixth year seniors that you just kind of know what they are. They're not really getting much better as football players. It's the opposite with Troy Pikes. He's done a phenomenal job with his body since he got to Georgia Southern. He's more of a disrupted interior defensive lineman, which is very important to South Carolina. You know, they that is a defense that when they're playing their best, when we saw in 2024, they're getting behind the line of scrimmage, they're shooting gaps, and they're creating negative plays. That's what Troy Pikes brings to whatever defense he goes to. We all know that South Carolina has I wouldn't say massive need, but the one position that South Carolina is going to look to address is on the defensive line, both at the edge room and on the inside. Troy Pikes, I think, would be a much needed addition to the South Carolina defense. Now, the big name, the heavy hitter name, you might say, is Murad Watson, who South Carolina is also trying to be a player in for. Now, this one would cost a pretty penny. You know, the all the heavy hitters are in for him. Texas, Ohio State, Georgia. Murad Watson, very similar to Troy Price. Murad Watson was a true freshman last year at Syracuse, played almost 500 snaps in the middle of that defensive line. Phenomenal against the run, which I think is the biggest priority for South Carolina. You look at South Carolina and say, even though you lose a guy like TJ Sanders, even though you lose a guy like Kyle Kennard, I still, when you have a guy like Dylan Stewart, you're going to be able to get after the passer at a pretty solid level. I think that the bigger concern for South Carolina is, hey, do we have enough big bodies in the middle of that defensive line to stop the run at a high level? Murad Watson would answer that question tenfold. I mean, he's one of the best run-stopping interior defensive linemen that you see in the country, and similar to a guy like Troy Pikes, he only going into year two. He was a true freshman All-American last year. This is a guy that you bring into your program, you get multiple years of eligibility from, and he's going to contribute immediately and be a starter for South Carolina in the middle of that defensive line. Now, what I think Shane Beamer and South Carolina are going to have to decide here is, do we want to pay him the money necessary to get him to come to South Carolina? Because you make no mistake, this kid is going to cost a lot of money in the spring transfer portal window. Now, another name, and kind of going back to what we talked about, he just hit the portal yesterday. Bernard Gooden from USF. TJ Sanders vibes, a little bit of an undersized interior defensive lineman, moves around, plays the three tech, plays the edge a little bit. Penetrator with a extraordinarily high motor. This is a guy that gets behind the line of scrimmage, creates a lot of negative plays, gives you a ton of pass rush juice on the inside. You're looking to replace the pass rush production from a guy like TJ Sanders on the inside. Bernard Gooden is going to give that to you. Now, Murad Watson from Syracuse, he's a little bit more of a run stopper that's still developing as a pass rusher. Bernard Gooden, he's a guy that can just pin his ears back from the inside and be a force as a pass rusher. Now, although he's undersized, I think plays the run pretty decently. You know, he fights hard. He gets off blocks. He's able to use his quicks to get behind the line of scrimmage. He's not that 330-pound two-gapper, but that's not really how South Carolina wants to play on defense. Like, they want to penetrate. They want to create negative plays. He's one of, if not the best player on the middle of that defensive line that fits what South Carolina wants to do and happens to be a massive need for South Carolina going into 2025. You know, I've said this a lot. If South Carolina can adequately address the middle of that defensive line, that changes how I look at this football team going into 2025. And whether it's Murad Watson, whether it's Bernard Gooden, you land one of those guys, changes how I look at South Carolina. I'm very interested to see if South Carolina gets in for a guy like Bernard Gooden. Last interior defensive lineman that I think is worth a look here is Jalen Stone from Southeast Missouri State. One, we just saw Clemson go out, make a Southeast Missouri State addition in Tristan Smith, and he's going to be awesome for Clemson. Run stopper, you know, kind of a fire hydrant build, 6'2", 295, very, very good against the run. Also only a guy that's going to be a redshirt sophomore. Still getting better as a football player, still developing, multiple years of eligibility remaining. and gives you what you're looking for, and that's a run stopping big body in the middle of that defensive line. Was going to go take a visit to Oklahoma with David Stone coming back to Oklahoma. Sounds like he is probably going to be a free agent once again, and I would be interested to see if South Carolina takes a look. Those are the names in the middle of that defensive line. I'll say this, really would like to see South Carolina go out and land one of the big names, because that's kind of what I think South Carolina is looking for. You want to address the depth, but I also think you want to try to replace the presence you got from a guy like TJ Sanders. Whether it's Murad Watson, whether it's Bernard Gooden, I think those would go a long way in terms of answering those questions. The other two positions that I think could be targets for South Carolina, off-ball linebacker and the edge. Now, the edge, Shane Beamer's been pretty vocal, like we want to address the edge. AJ Pena would be an interesting one. He was an FCS All-American, had over 10 sacks last year, over 15 tackles for a loss. The question here with AJ Pena is he's coming from Rhode Island to the SEC level. Can he make that jump? But he's a guy that lives behind the backfield. He's not necessarily the biggest edge defender, but what we've talked about pretty much the whole episode here is South Carolina wants guys. We don't necessarily care how big you are. Like TJ Sanders was not a big interior defensive lineman, but he did a great job getting behind the line of scrimmage and creating negative plays. It's kind of the same deal with AJ Pena out on the edge. Now, was at Memphis for a couple of months, hit the portal once again. I'll say that's probably a little bit of a concern for me. Like, did he go to Memphis and not get a starting spot and then hit the portal? If that's the case and you can't start on Memphis, I don't know if South Carolina is the place for AJ Pena, but there might have been some other things going on. This dude was very good at Rhode Island in the FCS. Last name I'd probably throw out there is Kamal Bonner. Starting off-ball linebacker for NC State, another young guy with a couple of years of eligibility remaining. Again, I think what's appealing about Kamal Bonner is he would immediately come in and be the most experienced linebacker in the room. Now, one of the things we learned from South Carolina in spring practice is that we feel better about where we are at linebacker than maybe what we thought heading into spring. So I'm not sure if this is as big of a concern as we thought it was going to be. But if you want to add one more guy with some experience at the Power 4 level, there's not many options. Kamal Bonner is one of them. A little bit of an undersized linebacker, but flies around the football field and, again, can get behind the line of scrimmage and play well in space, which is what we've seen from South Carolina is they are prioritizing speed. Like they want speed at all three levels. And Kamal Bonner at linebacker, he's got that speed, and that's really important in this era of college football. If you want to be a successful defense, you have to have linebackers that can run, chase, and tackle. You go back a couple of years to a guy like Stone Blanton at South Carolina. Stone Blanton might have been an elite linebacker in the 1990s. But in this era of college football where so many teams are running the RPOs and running those stuff to the outside, you got to have linebackers that can play in space, and Stone Blanton couldn't. Like Kamal Bonner can. Those are the names I'd be looking at. We'll see where South Carolina decides to go. I get the feel that this is when South Carolina is going to start getting aggressive. We'll see how it plays out. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.